Don't laugh, I'm being serious. If I were to ask the average person on the street whether or not their dog is a work of art, then yeah, most would probably say no. I, however, think there's a very good argument to be made that dogs are art, and that if they're not, then our existing definitions of art are inadequate or incomplete. At the very least, it's a question that complicates our understanding of art. So, let's start with a simple, probably very easy to answer question. What is art? Webster's dictionary... Yeah, that's how I'm starting. I will get into more academic definitions later. Sue me. Webster's dictionary defines art as works produced through the conscious use of skill and creative imagination, especially in the production of aesthetic objects. I actually quite like this definition of art, as I myself am a proponent of a broad definition. It includes what I would say is probably the most fundamental aspect of art, the one prescriptivist hill that I will die on. Art is only art if it is produced through consciousness, which excludes soulless AI art from meeting the definition. AI might accidentally produce something beautiful, but nature can be beautiful as well, and we don't call nature art. I mean, you could if you believe in intelligent design, but let's not get into those weeds. Anyway, I do somewhat dislike the emphasis of this description on aestheticism, since many works that are deliberately not aesthetically pleasing are also generally considered art, but on the whole, pretty okay broad definition. One problem though, it does definitely include at least certain dogs. Dogs are, as you are probably well aware, not a naturally occurring species of animal. They were bred from wolves by humans, with a variety of purposes in mind. Initially, those purposes were mostly practical, pulling sleighs, protecting livestock, hunting, etc. Later on, however, it became one of the nobility's favorite pastimes to breed new dog breeds with a variety of more aesthetic goals in mind. Because wouldn't it just be so cute to have a dog with a snout so short that it can't breathe properly, or so many folds that it can't give birth naturally, or a darling little stripe on its back that's actually a birth defect equivalent to a split spine in humans. Adorable. Whatever the ethics behind such practices, dogs produced this way do meet the definition of art we just examined. Breeders consciously used both their creative imagination and some degree of skill to achieve certain aesthetic goals, which means that at least certain dogs, according to foremost art authority Merriam-Webster's dictionary, are works of art. But okay, that is, as I just said, a pretty broad definition of art, and therefore one of the easiest ones to fulfill. Let's make it a bit harder for ourselves, and see if dogs fulfill some of the more academic definitions and theories of art. There's a couple of approaches you can take here, so let's just start anywhere with an essentialist approach. Essentialist approaches to defining art posit that there's one or some features that all artworks have in common with each other, but with nothing else, art's essence, and that essence makes those artworks art. Functionalism is a related approach, which posits that all art fulfills one certain function, and that anything that fulfills that function is art. The problem with these approaches is that I have yet to find a satisfactory answer to what essence or function that is, given the wide variety of things we call art. Being pleasing to the senses in one way or another, for example, is not something that binds all art, as some art is deliberately hard or unpleasant to digest, and besides, a lot of things that are generally agreed not to be art can be pleasing to the senses. I can find a mountain range or a sunset to be beautiful, but I'm fairly confident in saying that neither of those are art. You could add the qualifier that it has to be deliberately created by a person, but even then, problems remain. A hot bath may be pleasing to the senses, and a bathtub has been deliberately created by a human and filled with hot water by me, a conscious person, with the express purpose of being pleasing to the senses. If we were to accept a hot bath, that is not the tub but the bath itself as a whole, as a work of art, however, then we would have a definition of art that very few people would agree with. Something that is made through the conscious use of skill and creative imagination, the definition we used earlier, is probably the least problematic essentialist definition of art, in that those things that fall outside of the definition are generally not considered to be art. And as we have seen, that definition definitely includes at least certain dogs. Okay, so that didn't help us much. Let's try a different approach, the aesthetic creation theory of art as formulated by philosopher Zangwill. You could consider this theory an essentialist one, but it differs from most of those in that it is an artist-based approach that focuses on the process rather than the output. If a work is produced through a certain process, it is art. The resulting works don't need to have anything in common with each other than the process through which they were created. That process is as follows. First, an artist has to have the insight that certain aesthetic properties can be realized by creating certain non-aesthetic properties. Non-aesthetic properties here meaning things like shape, size, color, sounds, whatever. Secondly, the artist needs to have the intentions to realize these aesthetic properties in the non-aesthetic properties. And thirdly, through action, the artist has to be more or less successful in realizing these aesthetic properties through the use of these non-aesthetic properties. My only real problem with this definition is that while it leaves some margin for error in realizing the envisioned properties, it does seem to suggest that completely botched art that fails completely to realize the intended properties, is not art, which I would disagree with. Other than that, however, I think it's a pretty useful definition. However you may feel about it, it's clear that the breeding of certain dogs, the one that were bred for aesthetic purposes, fits this process, thus making, at least, again, certain dogs into works of art. Let's try another one, the historical approach, which posits that art is art when it fits into a certain established historical artistic tradition. That's too many adjectives. I think this definition has some huge problems, like who decides what counts as an artistic tradition and on what grounds? Can that even be decided without presupposing a more essentialist definition of art? What does it mean for something to fit into such a tradition, i.e., how substantially does something need to resemble previous works of art to be considered art itself? Does this mean that the first works of art are not actually works of art, because there was no tradition to speak of yet? So yeah, I'm personally not the biggest fan of this one, but let's apply it to dogs anyway. Is there an established artistic tradition that dogs can be said to fall into? Well, I think it can be argued that there is. The forms, colors, and other aesthetic elements that humans have at one point deemed desirable aesthetic traits in the dogs they bred were not created in a vacuum. I'd wager that the aesthetic standards used are probably the same ones that would have influenced visual artists like painters and sculptors at the time. I don't know if that's enough to say that these dogs fit into these traditions, but again, that mostly seems like a problem with the vagueness of this particular approach. So we'll just put down maybe for this one. We should probably also talk about institutional theories of art, which posit that art is whatever certain institutions, the quote-unquote art world, if we take George Dickey's influential approach, decides is art. This one kind of feels like giving up to me. Either this art world has certain criteria in mind for picking what's art and what isn't, in which case their judgment isn't actually the criterion that decides what is art, or they just pick arbitrarily, in which case you're essentially saying that anything could be art, but only if the right people say it's art, which seems very counterintuitive to me. You also run into a legitimacy problem again. Who is the art world? Who decides who they are? If they're picked based on certain knowledge about art, that kind of presupposes that one can be knowledgeable about art, independent of what institutions have to say about it, because otherwise how would you appoint one in the first place? As for the dog question, as far as I can find, at least one dog has been displayed in an art gallery. I'll spare you the details because they involve severe animal abuse, but at least one prestigious art gallery has displayed a dog as a work of art before, so according to institutional art theorists, yeah, I guess dogs are art, or at least one dog has been. Finally, let's take a look at anti-essentialism, which posits that there is no one definition of art, no one thing that all art has in common. Rather, we at one point declared something to be art, and then declared other things art because we figured they were sort of like the other things we already called art. Every work of art, therefore, has things in common with other forms of art, but there is no one characteristic that defines all art. If you reckon dogs are close enough to some other kind of art, then sure, you can call dogs art. If you don't think so, however, then they aren't. Perhaps controversially, I essentially think this is correct. Art is a category that we as humanity constructed long before we ever aimed to define it, and we often rely on the unspoken assumption that we more or less agree what art is. Because of that, we are all forced to intuitively construct our own definitions of art based on the examples of art we are exposed to, leading to views on art that are mostly in agreement as to what fits into that category, at least within cultures, but when edge cases present themselves, it becomes clear that individuals' conceptions of art are not the exact same. Moreover, I don't think it can really be said that any conception of art is objectively wrong, because a coherent definition of art is not how we decided what art was in the first place. This may all seem a little loosey-goosey for you. Maybe you do think that it's objectively wrong to label some things as art and others not. But I do think, given all we have said before, that this is your only real escape if you want to say that all dogs are definitely not art. If you want to convince me of that while still maintaining that art can be strictly defined, you're going to have to come up with a definition that I have not seen before. If you think you can do that, feel free to do so in the comments. I've been Bram, thank you, and good night. If you thought this video was at all interesting, you could show that by leaving a like and or a comment, and you could consider watching another one of my videos. All those things help me stand out in YouTube's algorithm, so I really do appreciate it if you do even one of those things. Thank you.